On October 12, 1972, a plane carried a young rugby team from Uruguay. They were headed for a match in Chile, full of life and excitement. The atmosphere was joyful. These were more than just teammates. They were friends, brothers, on what felt like a great adventure together. But the weather over the Andes was notoriously treacherous. The pilot, confident in his route, decided to proceed through a mountain pass. Suddenly, extreme turbulence hit the aircraft. The small Fairchild shuddered and dropped. Laughter quickly turned into a nervous, fearful silence. One of the pilots cried out. They had begun their descent too early. The mountain was right there, impossibly close and filling the view. The impact was a deafening roar of tearing metal. The tail section ripped away, taking several people with it into the cold, empty void. The front of the fuselage became a sled. It slid down the glacier at over 200 miles per hour in a horrifying, uncontrolled descent. Then came the silence. A profound, eerie silence broken only by the whistling wind. For many, the journey had ended forever. Those who could move began to stir. They stumbled out into a world of white. The cold was a physical shock, immediate and biting. 45 people had been on the flight. In those first moments, they counted just 27 survivors. The rest were gone. The 2 medical students on the team immediately began to work. They tended to broken bones and deep wounds with what little they had. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the temperature plummeted. Their first night was a brutal test of endurance against the freezing cold. They found a small radio, their only link to the outside world. They listened for any news of a rescue mission, of a search party. Over the next few days, planes flew by. They waved, they screamed, they used lipstick to write SOS on the roof of the fuselage. But the white plane was invisible against the snow. Each plane that passed without dipping its wings was another blow to their fragile hope. On the 10th day, they heard the terrible news. The official search for their plane had been called off. They were presumed dead. Their food was almost gone. A few squares of chocolate, a sip of wine. Starvation was no longer a distant threat. It was a certainty. They were surrounded by the bodies of their friends, preserved by the cold. A terrible, unthinkable idea began to form in their minds. It was a conversation no one ever thought they would have. To survive, they would have to do the unthinkable to stay alive. The act felt like a violation of the deepest human taboo. But the alternative was to simply lie down and die beside their friends. They made a pact together. They gave their permission to one another. If I die, you can use my body so that you may live on. It was an act of pure will, not hunger. They forced themselves to do it, praying for forgiveness and for simple understanding. Their days fell into a grim routine. They melted snow for water. They carefully rationed the very thing that kept them alive. On the evening of October 29th, disaster struck again. A low rumble grew into a terrifying roar. An avalanche hit them. They were trapped in total darkness, suffocating under the heavy weight of the snow. Panic set in as the precious air grew thin. For 3 days they were buried alive. When they finally dug their way out, they discovered 8 more of their friends were gone. The weeks dragged on without end. November passed. Their bodies were wasting away, but their collective resolve to live somehow held on. They knew staying at the crash site meant certain death. They had to seek help. It was a final, desperate gamble for survival. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa were chosen to go. They were among the strongest left. Everyone's life now rested on their shoulders. They had no climbing gear, wearing only layers of clothes and rugby shoes. They carried a small supply of human flesh for food. After days of climbing, they reached what they thought was the final summit. They desperately expected to see the green valleys of Chile. But all they saw was more snow and more mountains. an endless sea of white, jagged peaks. In that moment, hope very nearly died. But Nando refused to give up. He told Roberto that they would walk west, towards the setting sun and towards Chile. They descended for days on end. The snow began to thin. Finally, they saw signs of life. A lizard, then blades of grass. They were at the absolute limit of human endurance. Every single step was an agony, but they kept pushing each other forward. Then they saw it, a sign of other people, a discarded soup can. They knew they were getting closer to civilization. After 10 long days of trekking, they saw a man across a river. He was a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan. They were too weak to shout. Nando scribbled a desperate note. It said, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains." He tied it to a rock and threw it. The farmer read the note and understood. He threw back a piece of bread and motioned that he would go for help immediately. The next day, the helicopters came. The world, which had long forgotten them, was about to learn of their impossible story of survival. Nando guided the rescuers. He directed them back into the white hell he had just escaped. He had to save his friends. At the fuselage, the others heard the news on the radio. Weak, but filled with new energy, they listened to a distant chopping sound. The helicopters appeared over the ridge. The sight was surreal. After 72 days of isolation and despair, rescue was finally here. Their story shocked the entire world. It was a tale of unimaginable horror, but also one of incredible courage and the human spirit. 16 of the original 45 people had survived. They were mere skeletons of their former selves, but they were alive. They had to explain the unthinkable choice they made. They told the world what they did to survive, not with shame, but with simple honesty. The bond forged in those mountains has lasted a lifetime. They meet every year to honor the friends they lost on that mountain. At the crash site, a simple iron cross now stands. It marks the grave of the dead and honors the profound spirit of the living. The mountains that were their prison also became the setting for their salvation. It was a place of immense tragedy and profound love. Their story shows that in the face of death, the human will to live is more powerful than we can imagine. It asks what any of us might do. It reminds us that our deepest connections are often forged in our darkest hours, and that life itself is the most precious gift of all.